A very, very warm welcome to today's seminar here at SNS. My name is Mia Horn-Avrantzen, and I'm the CEO of SNS. And today is a very special day. First of all, we have a very great honor to introduce to you one of the most prominent economists of our days, Professor Raj Chetty, who will share with us some of his work on equality of opportunity. And our moderator, Raj Chetty, will introduce Raj a bit more in a more detailed introduction very soon. And it's a special day also because it's the first meeting we have in a new established series of talks that we will call IIES, SNS International Policy Talks. And it is a new collaboration between the Institute for International Economics at Stockholm University and SNS. And the purpose is to bring insights from leading international economists that visit the Institute and to bring them here, to introduce them to a wider public and also on issues which are very interesting to the Swedish public policy debate. So I can think of no one better than Raj Chetty to be the inaugural speaker on this new collaboration. So we are very, very happy to have you here and very honored that you did take the time to come to us. So with this said, I will leave the floor to today's moderator, Raj Chetty. Raj, you have a Ph.D. from Harvard, and you're now assistant professor at the Institute. And I know, and we all know probably that you have worked quite a bit with Raj in the past, and so we're very glad to have you here and to lead us through this day. Please, welcome. You have the floor.
So it's a pleasure to be here today at SNS and moderate this talk with Professor Raj Chetty from Stanford. I'm particularly delighted as Raj was my Ph.D. supervisor and continues to be a source of inspiration. He's a public economist who has not been only revolutionizing the field academically, but also he's on the forefront of tightening the connection between academic and public world. His research always been motivated by the key policy-relevant question. Raj realized that the answer to many questions buried in a vast amount of data collected by governments around the world, either for taxation or for other government programs. In an academic field that previously been very US-focused, Raj has made major contributions, not only using US administrative data, but went to wherever he could find the best data to answer the questions at hand. Let me give you some examples. To study unemployment insurance, he used Austrian registers, where he shows that the more cash available to the unemployed increases unemployment duration. To measure the effect of tax incentive on household saving, he used Danish registers. Here, Raj and his co-authors find that 85% of individuals of the population of Sweden are what he calls passive savers, meaning that they don't actively adjust their pension savings when a policy change. That's why, if we want to increase private pension saving, it's more effective to induce employers to put part of the pension, contribute to the pension system instead of changing the tax system and creating incentives. But today we will talk more about the Raj's recent work that has been mainly focused on the opportunities for the new generations of Americans. He started by studying the impact of education, and then he moved on by looking at the effect of the neighborhood as a package that includes the education system as one component. I believe, in particular, his research on education is very relevant for Sweden today, given our active debate about the trend in the quality of teachers. Raj will tell us himself about his most celebrated findings on the value of teachers. I thought I would take the opportunity to tell you about his findings about the value of the kindergarten classrooms. Raj shows that being randomly assigned to a higher quality kindergarten classrooms impact the grades of students, of the pupils, in the coming years. But what's more surprising is that these effects on the grades fade out throughout education. However, what remains measurably higher is the effect on non-cognitive components, like examples like effort, initiatives, or lack of disruptive behavior. The effect of a good kindergarten classroom, then he shows that they don't disappear once that people stop their education, but we can find their effects on college, on the earnings, on college attendance, and on lower teenage birth rates. What Raj works on education is a good example to illustrate the fact that he's not only making invaluable contribution to an academic field, but also is extremely effective in communicating the result of his research to the relevant policy communities. His finding on the value of high quality teachers that he will talk to us about made it to the front page of the New York Times and was included in the 2012 State of the Union speech of President Obama. With that said, Raj, we look forward to seeing what food for thought you have to offer to Swedish policymakers this morning on the equality of opportunity. Please join me in welcoming Raj Chetty.
So thanks so much, Arash, for the warm introduction. It's always nice when people say nice things about you, but especially meaningful when it's from a former student who's doing so well. So it's a pleasure to be here in Stockholm today to talk to you about equality of opportunity. And it's especially meaningful because, as you'll see in the talk I'm going to give, Sweden is in many ways, I think, in this context, a leader and something that we look to in the US in terms of trying to emulate in terms of opportunity and mobility. So I'm going to start at a big picture level by talking about the American dream, which people like to talk about a lot in the US, which is a complicated concept that means different things to different people. But I'm going to try to distill it to a simple statistic that we can measure systematically in the data, which is the probability that a child born to parents in the bottom fifth of the income distribution makes the leap all the way to the top fifth of the income distribution. So that's like the classic notion of the American rags to riches dream. So how common is that in the United States versus some other developed countries around the world where we have comparable data? In the US, you have a 7.5% chance of going from the bottom quintile to the top quintile. That compares with 9% in the United Kingdom, 11.7% in Denmark, 12% here in Sweden based on recent work by Martin Nybaum and others, and 13.5% in Canada. So these are quite substantial differences in mobility. Sometimes people react initially by saying, oh, even in places like Sweden and Canada, your chances of success are only 13% or something like that. That doesn't seem all that high, right? But you have to remember, of course, that no matter what you do, you can't have more than 20% of people in the top 20%. And so sort of a plausible upper bound on this number is 20%. That is, if your parents played no role at all in determining your outcomes, you'd expect 1/5 of children from each quintile to end up in the top fifth. So these are actually quite large differences in rates of upward mobility across countries. One way you might think about it loosely is that your chances of achieving the American dream are much higher if you're growing up in Canada or Sweden than in the United States. Now, these differences across countries have been the focus of a lot of policy discussion in the US, as people worry that the US is no longer a land of opportunity, as it maybe once was. But what I'm going to focus on today is not these cross-country differences, which, while they're interesting, are difficult to learn from because there's so many things that are different between Canada and Sweden and the UK and the US. Instead, I'm going to focus on the fact that rates of upward mobility vary even more within the United States. And I think we can actually learn a great deal from that and learn lessons that might translate to the Swedish context here. So in the work that I'm going to talk about, which is with Nathan Hendren, Pat Klein, and Emmanuel Saez, we calculate upward mobility for every metro and rural area in the United States. And we do that using de-identified tax records on 10 million kids born between 1980 and 1982. So basically, we have information on all children born in America in the early 1980s, and we're looking at their incomes when they're roughly 30 years old in their early 30s around 2012. And using that data, we construct this map here, which shows you the geography of upward mobility within the United States. So this map shows the same statistic that I started out with, your odds of reaching the top quintile of the national income distribution, conditional on starting with parents in the bottom quintile. And the map is colored so that lighter colors represent areas with higher levels of upward mobility. So in the lightest colored areas in the center of the country, you can see that rates of upward mobility exceed 16.8%, so higher than the numbers we saw for Denmark, Sweden, Canada, etc. And at the other end of the spectrum, in the darkest red colors, cities like Atlanta, Georgia, or Charlotte, North Carolina, the numbers are less than 4.5%, lower than any country for which we currently have data. So there's a very broad spectrum in terms of rates of upward mobility, even within the United States. Now, you can see the broad geographic variation for yourself. So the southeast of the country has much lower rates of upward mobility than the center of the country. The West Coast, the Bay Area, for instance, where I'm from, has pretty good statistics. San Jose at 12.9%, Salt Lake City at 10.8%, but then you see much lower rates in Chicago, for instance, at 6.5%. Another interesting pattern, here in Sweden, is you notice that the area where there are actually a lot of Swedish, Scandinavian immigrants seems to have very high rates of upward mobility. So maybe you guys just bring it with you when you come. Now, in this map, you see the broad regional variation, but if we zoom in, you can actually see that there's quite a bit of variation, even much more locally. So here I'm showing you the data at a county level in the New York metro area. Same statistic again. What are your chances of going from the bottom fifth to the top fifth of the national distribution? And you can see that even within the New York area, there's quite a bit of variation. So take the Bronx or Manhattan, for instance, where the numbers are around 7.3% or 9.9%, and compare that to Queens, one of the other boroughs of New York. And in Queens, you see the number is 16.8%. So even within New York, we're seeing something like a factor of 2 variation in children's chances of moving from the bottom quintile to the top quintile. So naturally, the question of interest to us as academics and to policymakers is to ask why upward mobility varies so much across areas and what ultimately we might be able to do to increase upward mobility in places where it doesn't look as high. So the first point I want to make in this context is that childhood environment really seems to be critical in driving these differences. That is, most of the variation in upward mobility across areas that I've been showing you in these maps appears to be caused by differences in the childhood environment where kids are growing up. So I'm going to demonstrate that by studying 5 million families that move between areas in the U.S. And here in this talk, I'm just going to give a brief summary of these results with an example. This afternoon, I'm going to give a talk at Stockholm University, which is basically much more detail on exactly this next set of slides. So let me illustrate the main finding here with a concrete example. So let's say we take a set of families that move from Manhattan. And just to pick a number, let's say if you're growing up in Manhattan from birth in a low-income family, let's say you earn about $30,000 on average when you're 30 years old, when we're measuring your income. And now consider a set of families that move from Manhattan to Queens, which, as we saw in the previous map, Queens seems to produce better outcomes for kids in low-income families. So let's say if you grew up in a low-income family from birth in Queens, you're earning $40,000 on average when you're 30 years old. So now what I want to do is take a set of families that move from Manhattan to Queens, and I'm going to look at how their kids do depending upon when they make that move. So we start by looking at children who move when they're exactly 9 years old from Manhattan to Queens. And why 9? That happens to be the earliest age we're able to look at with currently available data in the US, okay? So what we see here is that the children who make this move when they're exactly 9 years old, when we track them forward 21 years and look at their own earnings in adulthood, we see that they're earning on average something like $35,000. They're roughly halfway between the kids who grew up in Manhattan from birth and the kids who grew up in Queens from birth. So now that's for children who moved when they were exactly 9. So let's now repeat that analysis for children who moved when they were 10, 11, 12, 13, and so on. And what you see is a very clear and robust pattern, which is the later you make that move from Manhattan to Queens, the less of a gain you get. And if you move by the time you're in your early 20s, you get essentially no gain at all. And if you move after that point, the relationship is completely flat. So what do you see in this chart? I think there are 3 important takeaways. The first thing you can see is that the neighborhood in which you grow up really seems to matter. It's not just that the kids who grow up in Queens are different from the kids who grew up in Manhattan. Apparently, when a given child moves from Manhattan to Queens, we see a measurable difference in that child's long-term outcomes. Now, a further finding that really convinced us that it seems like place matters here is if you compare siblings within the same family who make this move. So let's say you have a family that has a 9-year-old and a 13-year-old and moves from Manhattan to Queens. We find that the 9-year-old does better than the 13-year-old exactly in proportion to the 4-year age gap between those children. So even comparing within families, you get exactly this type of relationship, which really suggests that the environment seems to matter. So that's the first lesson. Place, neighborhood seems to matter. The second point is that it really looks like it's childhood environment that matters as opposed to where you are as an adult. As you can see here, it's moving when you're a kid that really seems to make a difference, right? And that's important because it suggests that we should be thinking about things like schools or other factors that affect children while they're growing up, and not so much local labor market conditions or other things that affect you directly in adulthood. And then the third point that you see here is that every extra year of childhood seems to matter roughly equally. That is, this relationship prior to the age of 20 or so is roughly linear. And that's a very important point in the context of current policy debates, where, as you probably know, there's a lot of discussion of early childhood interventions as having potentially great returns. And while our view is that that may well be the case, we think that early childhood interventions like better preschools and so forth can be very valuable, these data show you that improving environments, even when children are 10 years old or 15 years old, continues to have substantial returns. So it's not that the value to intervening kind of completely decays after kids become 5 or 6 years old. You continue to see significant benefits after that point. Okay, so we see that childhood environment really seems to matter in driving these differences. Now, the next step in our analysis is to try to unpack what is it that's making Queens apparently generate better outcomes than Manhattan for a given child. So we've looked at the association between various factors and these differences in upward mobility across areas. In the interest of time, I'm just going to summarize a few of the key correlations that we find. So I'm going to summarize the 5 strongest patterns we find in terms of what is related to these differences in mobility across areas. So the first is segregation. We find that places that are more segregated by income or by race tend to have lower levels of upward mobility. That is residential segregation. Now, there are many different ways in which you can measure segregation. It turns out that the precise statistic you use doesn't actually matter that much because the patterns are so clear in the US that you can just see them visually. And so let me illustrate with a couple of examples. So this map here depicts racial segregation in the city of Atlanta. And the way it's constructed is using data from the census. Each person in Atlanta is represented by a dot, and the dots are colored so that whites are blue, blacks are green, Asians are red, and Hispanics are orange. And you can see immediately, regardless of how you measure segregation, Atlanta is an incredibly segregated city, right? The green dots are just completely distinct from the blue dots. The blacks and whites live in completely different parts of the city. And corresponding to that, we find that Atlanta and places that look like it in terms of residential segregation tend to have the lowest rates of upward mobility in the US. In contrast, if we look at Sacramento, which actually has the same share of blacks and Hispanics, the same minority share as Atlanta, you can see immediately that the dots are much more interspersed, right? There's much more residential integration in Sacramento. And consistent with that, we find that places like Sacramento tend to have much higher rates of upward mobility. Now, we don't know exactly what is driving this relationship. There are many potential theories for why you might find a link between segregation and rates of upward mobility, things like peer effects or role models or availability of funding for public goods when you live in a more integrated setting. Whatever the mechanism might be, the fact to take away here is that there seems to be this strong association between having more integrated areas and better outcomes for people in low-income families. And that's a lesson I think that could be relevant here in Sweden as well, as there are an increasing number of immigrants thinking about where these new people are located and so forth. Okay, the second strong pattern we find is that places with more income inequality tend to have lower levels of intergenerational mobility. That is, if you have a smaller middle class in an area, you also tend to have less mobility across generations. And insofar as there's actually a causal link between those two things, that's potentially concerning, especially in the US, as inequality is rising sharply over time. It suggests that we might see an erosion in the rates at which people achieve the American dream of moving up across generations as well. Now, the third and fourth factors come more from the sociology literature. The single strongest correlation we actually find in the data is that areas with more single parents have lower rates of upward mobility. So that is, communities that have more two-parent households tend to have higher mobility. Now, in understanding what's going on there, one intuition you might have is this is just driven by whether your own parents are married or not. And growing up in a two-parent household might have beneficial effects relative to growing up in a one-parent household. That might be part of the story, but that's certainly not all of it, because we find that even if we look at the subset of children whose own parents are married, if they're growing up in a city with a lot of single parents, they tend to be less likely to move up in the income distribution. So this is not literally about whether your own parents are married or not. It's about whether again, it's a community level factor. It's picking up something about the nature of cities that have lots of single parents versus cities that have more stable family structures. The fourth factor, somewhat related to that, social capital. So this is this concept popularized by Bob Putnam, is the notion of how cohesive a society is. I think of the old adage that it takes a village to raise a child as capturing what social capital is about. Even if you're not doing well, someone else in your community might help you out. And in the US, the Salt Lake City with the Mormon church is thought to be the classic example of a city with a lot of social capital, and it's a place that has very high rates of upward mobility. Now, as I mentioned, this concept of social capital was popularized by Bob Putnam in a famous book called Bowling Alone. And the reason for the title of that book is that Putnam, recognizing that social capital is very difficult to measure, used the number of bowling alleys in an area as a measure of social capital. Now, I was amazed to find in our own data that the number of bowling alleys is, in fact, very highly correlated with differences in upward mobility across areas. I mentioned that here because it illustrates well an important caveat to everything I'm showing you on this slide, which is that these are correlations rather than causal effects, right? I doubt the policy lesson from this analysis is that we should build more bowling alleys to increase upward mobility. And so the fifth factor I'm going to talk about is a bit of an exception to that. So we find a strong correlation between the quality of public schools in an area and rates of upward mobility. But here, as Arash was mentioning from some of our earlier work and work that many other scholars have done, we think there's very clear evidence of causal effects. So unlike with the other factors where, I see them as useful hints in terms of where we should look for potential policy interventions, in this fifth case, I think we can actually concretely say that trying to improve the quality of schools in specific ways can make a big difference. And so I want to spend a bit of time illustrating that in more detail by now turning to a different study where we look at the long-term impacts of teachers, in particular, one key input in the quality of schools, to show the role that they can play in terms of improving upward mobility. So the way we do this is, again, using these large administrative data sets. And what we do is we take information on all children who went to New York City public schools between 1989 and 2009. So that's about 2.5 million kids who've written about 18 million tests over that period. And we link that data to the income tax record data that I was using for the first part of the analysis that I was showing you. And using that, we're able to look at these children's earnings, which colleges they went to, whether they had a teenage birth, and so forth. So when you link these two data sets, you can effectively ask a question like, how does the quality of your third grade teacher affect how much you're earning when you're 30 years old? Now, in order to answer that question, the first thing we need to do is define a measure of the quality of teachers, right? If I want to show you that higher quality teachers have an impact, I have to have some concrete way of measuring the quality of teachers. The measure we focus on is one that's very topical in the US, very relevant to the current policy debate. It's what are called value-added measures of teacher quality. So there's some complicated statistics in the background, but the basic concept of these value-added measures is extremely simple. Essentially, we ask how much a teacher raises his or her students' test scores on average to calculate that teacher's value added. So for example, if I am a fourth grade teacher, we would calculate my value added by looking at my students' test scores at the end of fourth grade on average, minus their test scores, say, at the end of third grade on average. And if that number is very positive, then we'd say I'm a high value added teacher. And if that number is very negative, we'd say I'm a low value added teacher. Now, these value added measures are very widely discussed in the US at the moment because a number of school districts are starting to use these sorts of quantitative measures to evaluate the performance of teachers and select which teachers to keep and which teachers to recruit and so forth. And so understanding their properties is of direct policy interest. So what we want to do is basically ask, what is the effect of being assigned to a high versus low value-added teacher on a child's long-term outcomes? Now, when trying to answer a question like this, it's often useful to step back and ask, what is the ideal experiment you would run from a scientific perspective in order to answer that question before turning to the empirical analysis? And so in this context, the experiment you'd like to run is take a set of teachers and estimate their value added based on their students' prior historical data, right? So say a teacher is taught for 5 years, we can use earlier data to classify all the teachers as high versus low value added. And then we'd take a new batch of kids and we'd tell their parents, look, we want to answer this really important policy question of whether teacher value added matters for kids' long-term outcomes. So we're going to run an experiment with your kids where we'll randomly assign some of your children to teachers we've identified as being high value added and some as being low value added, and let's see how your kids do 25 years from now. So as you can imagine, running that experiment is not very easy in practice. And so the power of having these huge data sets, where Sweden, I think, is really a pioneer in leading this sort of thing, is that we can essentially approximate this experiment with the data we already have. And so to illustrate that, this, what I'll call a quasi-experimental methodology, we're going to exploit the fact that there's a lot of turnover in schools, lots of teachers coming in and going out, which effectively creates something analogous to the experiment I just described. So to show you that concretely, let's say we're tracking a given school over time, and we're going to look at fourth graders who enter the school in different years. So fourth graders in 1993, 1994, 1995, and so forth, different cohorts of kids. And so let's look at the evolution of fourth grade test scores over time in this school. And we see that, test scores are kind of bouncing around the median, okay? This is based on averaging thousands of such data points in this huge data set I was describing. And what happens at the end of the 1995 school year is that a new teacher comes in who, based on prior data, we've identified as being in the top 5% of the distribution in terms of her value added. So a very highly effective teacher based on this value-added metric. And so let's look at what happens to test scores when that high value-added teacher comes in. You can see that test scores immediately jump up and continue to stay high as that teacher continues to teach subsequent cohorts of children. Okay, so that suggests that having a high value-added teacher has a causal impact on children's test score performance. Now, we all know that in any experiment like this, you want to have a treatment group, which is analogous to what I just showed you here, but you also want to have a control group to make sure that nothing else changed at the same time that might have contaminated this analysis. And in this context, there's a very natural control group, which is to look at third graders, because the idea is that the better teacher came in fourth grade. She should have improved fourth grade test scores, but should have had no effect on third grade test scores, right? Because those were measured before those students were taught by this teacher. And in fact, when we plot test scores in third grade, you see that they don't change at all when that better teacher comes in, which lends credence to the hypothesis, to the claim that this really captures the causal effect of the teacher. So you can see we're essentially able to approximate the experiment I was describing by exploiting the fact that lots of teachers come in and go out like this. And so here you see that an excellent teacher immediately raises her students' test scores. This works symmetrically in the other direction as well, right? So if you get this teacher who's in the bottom 5% of the distribution and doesn't want to be there, he immediately pulls down test scores in fourth grade relative to third grade. So it's completely symmetric across the distribution. So this here, I've been showing you that teachers really affect how well their students do on tests. But now to tie it back to where we started, thinking about children's long-term outcomes, we repeat exactly this type of analysis using children's earnings or college attendance rates or other outcomes instead of test score measures, right? And just to summarize in a simple way what we get from that analysis, let me use this hypothetical policy exercise here. So let's say we take the bell curve of teacher quality as measured by value added and consider a simple policy change, which is something that is being widely discussed and implemented in the US. Let's say we identify the teachers who are in the bottom 5% of the distribution based on their estimated value added. And suppose we either implement a training program or hire new teachers to bring the quality of these teachers up to the average, okay? So that's in principle a feasible policy intervention if we hire new teachers to replace the teachers who were in the bottom 5%. So what are the effects of such a change? We estimate, based on exactly the type of analysis that I was showing you, that simple change, having a teacher of average quality instead of the bottom 5% for a single year, would increase the lifetime earnings of the average child in the US by an undiscounted sum of $50,000, which for a classroom of average size in the US, which has about 28 students, would be worth $1.4 million per classroom. Or if you discount that back to present value and view this as an investment, discounted at 5% interest rate, it's worth about $250,000 when kids are 10 years old per classroom. So relative to the typical salaries of teachers, the value of having highly effective teachers relative to less effective teachers is incredibly large. And more generally, this underscores the fact that trying to improve the quality of teachers and schools more broadly can be a very powerful way of increasing rates of upward mobility. So I'm going to show you one final set of results which approaches these issues of equality of opportunity from a different perspective. The traditional argument for greater social mobility, the interest that a lot of people have in these issues, I think comes from principles of justice or equity, the idea that everyone should have a shot at doing well regardless of their family background. But the last point I want to make is that improving opportunities for upward mobility or increasing social mobility can also increase the size of the economic pie. So even if you're purely interested in productivity and aren't set aside concerns about equity and justice, you might still be interested in having higher rates of upward mobility, particularly in a place like the US. And so to illustrate that, I'm going to focus on one specific pathway to upward mobility, which is innovation. And here we've linked data on the universe of patent holders in the United States, 750,000 patent holders. We've linked that data again to the tax records in order to study the lives of inventors. So using having a patent as a proxy for being an inventor, we basically ask where do inventors come from, and ultimately how can we get more inventors in the US. And so let me start with this chart here, which shows you patent rates versus parents' income. So on the y-axis here is the number of kids who go on to become inventors by their mid-30s or so. And on the x-axis is their parents' household income percentile. There are 100 dots, one for each percentile of the parent income distribution, and we're plotting the average number of kids who go on to become inventors within each of those bins. So you can see that if you happen to be born to parents in the top 1% of the income distribution, you're 10 times as likely to have a patent as if you happen to be born to parents at the median of the income distribution. That is, there's an incredibly strong relationship between parents' income and the probability that children go on to become inventors. Now, there are many potential explanations for this pattern. One possibility is that it's about differences in schools and childhood environment and the types of things we've been talking about here. Another possibility is that it's about differences in ability. Perhaps the kids of children in the top 1% are just more talented, and maybe that's why they're more likely to become inventors. Now, we can discriminate between these two different explanations by turning back to that New York City test score data that I was showing you earlier and using test scores as a measure of ability early in childhood. So to show you how this works, let me turn to this chart here, which has the same y-axis. We're again looking at the number of kids who go on to become inventors, but now versus their third grade math test scores. So each dot here represents 5% of the test score distribution. So there are 20 dots on this chart. And what you can see is there's a very strong relationship between your probability of becoming an inventor and your third grade math test scores. Unfortunately, if you're below something like the 90th percentile of your third grade math class, you're probably not going to go on to have a patent. And then that probability really shoots up in the upper tail of the distribution, as you might expect. Okay. What is more interesting, I think, from the perspective of this talk, is if we split this data out by the parents' income. So the blue here represents kids from middle and low-income families below the 80th percentile of the distribution. And the red shows the same series for kids from high-income families above the 80th percentile of the distribution. Now we see a very striking pattern here, which is that these high-ability kids who are scoring at the top of their third grade math class, they're much more likely to become inventors if they're from high-income families. If you're from a low-income family and you're at the top of your third grade math class, it doesn't seem to do a whole lot for you in terms of increasing the probability that you become an inventor. So to put this differently, in the United States, it looks like in order to become an inventor, you need two things. You need to be really smart as measured by your third grade test scores, and you need to be from a rich family. And from that perspective, you can see that trying to increase opportunity and increase the number of those low-income kids who are really smart, help them come through the pipeline and become inventors, that can be really useful from the perspective of productivity and increasing GDP growth, independent of the fact that it would increase their own earnings and increase their own rates of upward mobility. Now, just to tie this back to the geographic variation that I started out with, this map here shows you geographic variation in children's propensity to become inventors. So for the same 740 metro and rural areas in the US, we calculate the fraction of children who grow up in an area and go on to have a patent. And the red colors on this map represent areas that generate more inventors. And you can see just visually from this map a very clear pattern, which is the places that are the innovation hubs of the U.S., like Silicon Valley on the West Coast, or the Northeast around Boston, or you see, in the South. In the South in general, there's very low rates of innovation, with one exception, that's Austin, Texas, around the University of Texas, Austin, where you see lots of kids growing up to become inventors. So again, this shows you that there's a lot of geographic variation in terms of kids' propensity to achieve this particular outcome. And what these data show in particular is that it seems to matter a lot what you grow up around. So growing up around an area where there's a lot of innovation makes a given child more likely to become an inventor. What is particularly striking is that's true within specific technology classes. So let me give you an example. Let's say we take two kids who currently live in Boston and say one of them grew up in Silicon Valley, which has a lot of computer innovation, and say one of them grew up in Minnesota, which happens to have a lot of pharmaceutical companies. Turns out when you look at the data that the kid who grew up in Minnesota is particularly likely to have a patent in pharmaceuticals or something like medical devices, exactly the sort of thing around which he or she grew up. And the kid who grew up in Silicon Valley is much more likely to have a patent exactly in computers. And this turns out to be true even at very fine technology classification. So if you look at like particular types of semiconductors, if you grew up in an area where people are doing that sort of thing, you're more likely to have exactly that kind of patent. So I mentioned that here because it again suggests that the pathway, the critical pathway here is about exposure during childhood. And kids from low-income families presumably just have less of these exposures no matter where they live. The kids from high-income families are more likely to have the internships or the connections or whatever else that's exposing them to these fields. So let me conclude by talking about some policy lessons, and then I'm sure we can discuss more broadly. So one, I think, broad policy lesson that comes out of this work is that we should be thinking about issues of social mobility, at least in the United States, at a local and not just a national level. Now, there's been some interesting analogous work done in Sweden looking at regional variation, and my sense is there's less regional variation in Sweden than the United States, partly because it's just geographically a smaller country than the US, but it could also be about more uniform national policies in Sweden than in the US. But I think regardless, going forward, it's an important lesson to keep in mind, especially as the nature of the population changes. If you have more segregated communities within the country, my sense is you can get to a situation that looks much more like the United States. So at least in the US, I think rather than thinking about the American dream, what we've been trying to do is get people to focus on why is the American dream not alive in Atlanta or in Baltimore, and why is it in a much better state in other parts of the country? Now, how can you go about, given that knowledge that, local area really seems to matter, how can you go about trying to improve mobility? Well, one thing you can do is to try to help low-income families with young kids move to higher opportunity areas, for instance, by targeting housing vouchers. So in the US, we have a big housing voucher program that gives low-income families assistance to rent apartments or houses potentially in better areas. But that program doesn't really seem to be serving its intended purpose because 80% of the housing vouchers that people get are currently used in low opportunity areas, in the redder colored areas on the maps I was showing you. So the vast majority of people who are getting this $20 billion of money from the government aren't really using it to rent places in better neighborhoods. So at the moment, we're working with the government and 15 public housing authorities around the US to develop a set of interventions on the supply and demand side of the housing market to figure out how we can get more of these low-income families to move to higher opportunity areas with the money that they're already getting from the government. Now, importantly, and I think this is a lesson that might be relevant here as well, your intuition might be that these high opportunity areas are the expensive parts of the city. And so this is going to be a very expensive proposition because we have to move people to much more affluent places. But that's actually not necessarily the case. And so let me just quickly illustrate that with this chart here, which shows you on the y-axis our measure of the degree of opportunity in the area, so the effect of the place on a child's earnings. So the places that are farther to the top of this graph are places that we estimate generate more positive impacts on kids. The places at the bottom generate worse impacts. And each dot in this figure represents one zip code within the New York City area. So we're plotting this opportunity index versus the average rent in that zip code. So there's an upward sloping relationship here. As you might expect intuitively, the more expensive places generate higher levels of opportunity. And so on the far right there, you see a place called Park Slope, which is where the mayor of New York used to live. So that's a place that generates a lot of opportunity and is quite expensive, okay? But the key point is that you can go directly to the left on this graph and go to a place like Rockaway Park or East Midwood, which are neighborhoods that we estimate generate exactly the same effects on kids but are half the price in terms of rent. So in a sense, there are opportunity bargains, right? There are places where you can help people move that are still affordable. And so my intuition is that there, in any city, there are going to be places like this that are not the most expensive places, but still generate good outcomes for kids. And so what we're working with the Housing and Urban Development Agency in the U.S. to do is try to target more families to these opportunity bargains, which is, I think, a powerful way to try to increase mobility. Now, you can't just rely on moving people around. That's not a scalable solution. So you also need to think about how you can invest in places that currently have low levels of opportunity by improving the quality of schools or something else to increase rates of upward mobility. The second lesson, as I've been emphasizing, is that we should be focusing on improving childhood environments. It's not just about spending more money. In fact, the U.S. already spends more money than most other countries on schools, but generates worse outcomes. Instead, I think it's about focusing on key inputs like improving the quality of teachers, which I talked about here, or there's a lot of other work showing that specific types of charter schools generate extremely good outcomes, and so trying to expand those types of schools can be very valuable. And then finally, at the biggest picture level, as I've been showing you here, these types of administrative data, which you have a lot of in Sweden, but more broadly, big data from the private sector as well, can be very valuable in developing a scientific evidence base for economic and social policy. One of the things that I think is useful to do with these data is to use them for public monitoring of progress. So what we've done with the statistics I've been showing you here is made everything that I've been describing at the county and metro area level publicly available so that communities can see over time whether they're making progress, whether mobility is going up or going down and so forth. And that, I think, can be really valuable. More generally, we're working with government agencies in the U.S. to create a system to monitor local trends using the data we already have to understand how inequality and opportunity are evolving at a local level. So my hope is these kinds of statistics can be very useful in informing the policy debate and ultimately help us identify solutions to improving mobility, both in the U.S. and around the world. So thanks very much.
Great. So now the ground is... Can you hear me? Yeah. So the ground is open for questions. Maybe we start with Eva Mjörk, who has done great jobs on local governments.
Okay. Thank you for a very inspiring talk. Is it on? Yes. So my question concerns these differences between boys and girls that you didn't talk much about today, but in your neighborhood paper you find that these neighborhoods seems to be more important for boys than for girls. And this is, same results as David Autor finds with this fragile boy hypothesis. So using Swedish data, me and Anna, who sits behind me, and Helena Svalryd, so we've been looking at social gradients in health for kids. And there we find that these gradients are surprisingly equal for boys and girls. And also when we look at being sick in childhood, how does that affect, early life outcomes, like earnings in the early 20s and stuff like that. We also find no differences between boys and girls. So my question is, do you think Sweden with its gender equality is different with this respect, or do we not capture these more long-run outcomes in earnings and stuff like that, looking at these health data?
Yeah, thanks. That's very interesting. So let me just recap. So the one of the findings, which I didn't talk about here, is that the variation across neighborhoods is much greater for boys than for girls. And in particular for boys, you see really extreme lower tail outcomes in certain cities. So in Baltimore, for example, we see very poor outcomes for boys, but not so much for girls. And as you were saying, there are two different possible explanations. I think one is that there is actually something genetic that's different about boys and girls, which is a little bit along the lines of David Autor's hypothesis. Another possibility is that it's more institutional. So what we think might be going on with the Baltimore example, and more generally why boys seem to be doing more susceptible, is that this may have to do with incarceration rates in the U.S. and other types of policies that affect men more than women. So in our data, the kids who end up in prison are included as having zero income. And that, of course, has a really negative effect on rates of upward mobility. And the rates of incarceration at the bottom end of the income distribution are shockingly high. So in a given year, something like 10% of boys born to families at the bottom of the income distribution in the US are in prison. And that's in a single year, right? So if you think about over a decade or something, it's an incredibly high fraction. And in a high African-American city like Baltimore, it's going to be even higher than that. Contrast for girls, it's incredibly rare. And so we think part of this might be, I think, perfectly consistent with your evidence, not so much pure genetic difference in terms of susceptibility of boys versus girls, but partly due to the institutions in an area. And consistent with that, we have a subsequent paper, which was in the AEA Papers and Proceedings this year, which shows that those gender differences actually also vary a lot across areas. So the boy-girl difference is not stable, as you might expect if it was a totally genetic thing. So I think in that sense, our evidence is actually quite consistent with yours.
So just I would like to ask, before asking your question, just introduce yourself. And please. Yes. And wait for a microphone. Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
So my name is Disa Turesson, and I'm a researcher at the Swedish National Road and Research Transportation Institute. So when you were talking about this, I thought about this TV series The Wire, when you talked about Boston.
Yeah,
and
Baltimore.
Yeah. Baltimore, yeah. I mean, and I don't know if you have seen it, but it's much of it, you follow first some cops, and you follow the bottom neighborhood, or what you could call it. And there are a lot of families there where with single moms, and the boys have a career from very young age to sell drugs at the street.
Yep.
Which the girls doesn't have.
Yeah.
What it seems like. Their career is to become single moms.
Yeah.
That territory. So, I mean, that's also like this culture difference in what you expect from, or these kind of neighborhoods expect from boys and girls, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
Would also be part of the explanation.
I agree. And I mean, that's consistent with what I was saying at the end, that exposure seems to matter in very specific ways. So I was talking about the high end of the outcome distribution with the patents, but a very similar thing with dealing drugs or other very specific activities pathways you might follow being influenced by those around you. And I agree that those could be gender specific as well.
So Professor Anders Björklund, who worked on intergenerational wealth mobility, one of the first papers on Sweden.
I was supposed to comment from a Swedish perspective. What should we learn from this, and what should politicians learn? And I think that's to some extent difficult, because the most general lesson here is that I think that outcome inequality is positively related to opportunity inequality. And that, I think, is a very general message. It's not very instrumental for what the Parliament should decide upon the next year or so. So in order to be more instrumental about these issues and think about lessons for Sweden, I think what we are missing here is good information about skill for children at a rather young age, because that's a much more instrumental way to look at the impact of family background. It doesn't take 30, 40 years until you can measure the outcomes, so you can do it quite quickly. And that's exactly, I think, what we are missing here in Sweden. Of course, it's also quite fascinating that you have these moving to opportunity experiments, and it would be really great if politicians start to think about such experiments as well. So that was more reflections.
Yeah, I agree with all of that.
Please.
I'm Robert Eriksson. I'm at the Swedish Institute for Social Research at the University of Stockholm. And I would just say that mobility is a two-way process. So what about downward mobility? I mean, would you be able to show equal maps, similar maps for downward mobility? Yeah. In a way, downward mobility, I would say, to some extent may tell you us more about the society than upward mobility. So it's an interesting question.
Yep. So let me say two things on that. So, of course, mobility in terms of percentiles has to be a zero-sum game. If somebody moves up, somebody's got to move down. So the first thing to note is at In the maps that I was showing you, everyone was ranked in the national income distribution rather than the local income distribution, and that's very important because it means that it isn't a zero-sum game within any one small area. And the ranks are effectively like absolute income measures because any one area is very small relative to the nation as a whole. So if you were to define the outcome as just the average income in terms of absolute dollars of kids in low-income families, you get very similar patterns. Now, a separate question is how are the kids in high-income families doing, and what does that map look like? And the key fact there, which we find in many different studies, is that there's just much less variation across areas for kids in high-income families relative to kids in low-income families. So that is, it matters a lot where you grow up if you're poor, but not if you're rich. Kids in rich families in Atlanta do just as well as kids in rich families in the Bay Area. And that, I think, makes sense intuitively because if you think about the kids in the highest income families in Atlanta, they're going to private schools, they're kind of insulated from local conditions. And so we basically find that the map just has much less variance higher up in the income distribution.
I'm Anna Sjögren. I'm a researcher at IFAU in Uppsala. So I have a question about one of your solutions, which is the moving to opportunity idea, which sounds very attractive, but you yourself mentioned that it's hard to bring it up to some kind of scale. And sort of relating a little bit to the question of, so what happens to those who are left behind if you incentivize some families to move out?
Yep.
What happens to those areas where presumably those that take a chance are maybe slightly different from those that do not take a chance?
Yeah.
And what do we do to their kids?
Yeah. So it's a very fair question. So the best evidence we have is just on the people who themselves moved. And when we go back and look at the Moving to Opportunity experiment, which I didn't talk about here, but we've done another analysis, we do find these really significant gains for those families. You're right to ask about what happens to the communities that are left behind. So the first thing I will say is something like 1 in 4 low-income families in the U.S. moves every year anyway. So the way you want to think about this is not that there are a set of families who are never moving and you're going to pluck them out of their neighborhood and move them somewhere else. The way I think about it more is a set of families are already moving for some reason. Let's try to get them when they're making that move to move to a better area. So then, conditional on them already moving, you're not changing the base rate at which something is changing in their original neighborhood, right? Now, that said, I think you still need to think about investing in the places, in places that people are leaving. There's no way you can just rely on moving as a solution. However, I think nobody disputes that. And so the challenging thing there is to figure out how exactly do you go about doing it. I talked about schools as one potential mechanism, but I think there are many other things that can matter, and we don't know exactly what the recipe is yet. One final point on this. So recently I was in Baltimore, and so we went to see what the city is like and get a feel on the ground for what can actually make a difference. And what you notice there is something like 70% of the properties in the neighborhoods you were describing from the show, for example, are vacant. So they're actually, the vast majority of the place is already vacant, right? So if you think about in some of these areas helping some of the remaining families move to better neighborhoods, at some point, if 95% of the buildings in an area are vacant, it's not clear that you want to commit yourself to revitalizing that place. At some point, you might want to just try to focus on other areas. And so at least in the US, there are places like that.
Please.
Hi, Emanuela is my name from Konjunkturinstitutet. I was wondering if you can, this is a very long shot question, but I was wondering if you can see any correlation between inequality of opportunity and the outcome in the last primary elections in the US. Whether you see more support for one candidate or the other in.
So we try to stay away from that ourselves. But the New York Times has done such an analysis using these data, and you could kind of see in the map that I showed you that there isn't a clear political correlation because there are some Republican or right-leaning states that look like they have very low levels of mobility, like the Southeast. But then there's the middle of the country, like Iowa and other places in the center, that also are right-leaning, that have the highest levels of mobility. So if you just do a raw comparison of more left versus right-leaning places and look at levels of mobility, you actually don't find a systematic difference. Now, I do think that politics and policy matters, so there's probably a more nuanced version of that comes through, but it's not as simple as, Democrat versus Republican.
I was thinking more of Trump versus everybody else.
I don't know exactly how that pans out. We've done some other work recently on life expectancy and how it varies across areas and how it relates to income. And so what we do know is that people tend to live much shorter lives in places that go for Trump. That seems to be a clear pattern in the data.
I'm Adam. I'm a PhD student at Stockholm School of Economics. I was wondering, so in comparing Sweden and the US, I guess Sweden has a much more, in terms of absolute dollars, the difference between the low-income earners and the high-income and disposable income is much smaller. So what kind of impact does that have on this kind of analysis? Are the consequences, is your analysis more about the relative perspective of, in the income ladder, or is it more about getting more money?
Yep. Yeah, so that's a good point. So the very first slide that I showed you comparing across countries, among the various other things that could be driving the difference is just the simple fact that the income distribution is more compressed in places like Sweden and Canada than the US. And so maybe that's why it's easier to climb from the bottom to the top. So that's why I think that's one of the reasons I think you can actually learn more from the local area analysis. And that's why in the local area analysis, we were careful to always define the ranks in the national distribution so that you exactly get around that problem, right? That it's not easier to get from the bottom to the top in San Francisco relative to some other place because of the difference in the local income distribution. It's always the same distance between the quintiles. And so in the bulk of what we're doing, absolute income dollar changes and relative are the same thing because of the way we've defined it.
Adrian Ederman, who was working also on wealth inequality.
Yes, hello. So, very nice talk. So in Sweden, we've been falling in the PISA rankings of educational outcomes. Mm-hmm. And there's also some anecdotal evidence, at least, that we seem to be recruiting new teachers from maybe the lower half of the skill distribution. So you've showed that good teachers can really make a difference. Mm-hmm. But do you have any thoughts on how we find these good teachers and recruit them to start with?
The challenging thing in terms of trying to identify better teachers is that we haven't really found good predictors of teacher quality until we actually see performance, right? So in other words, when you look at all the things you can measure on CVs, you never find anything that's really a strong predictor of ability to teach well. And so that then favors a model where you have sort of tryouts in some way, where there's like an internship or you have a couple of years where people are evaluated, and then you try to keep the better teachers. In the longer run, you would ideally develop better predictors of teacher quality. I think some of the most interesting work in this area comes out of psychology, looking at measures like grit and persistence. So not the traditional academic measures like what were your test scores or, which college did you go to, but rather other things about how well you're able to stick with a task and relate to people and so forth. And so maybe there'll be some scope to try to do evaluation on that front to try to identify better teachers. But I would say in the US, one of the main problems is that teaching is not perceived as a very prestigious or, a good occupation to go into, independent of the salary. It doesn't attract the most talented students. And so I think that maintaining that social norm that teaching is viewed as one of the really top professions to go into if you're a very skilled person, that at the broadest level, that strikes me as the most important thing.
Mr. Hand.
Thank you. My name is Tove Samselius, and I work for Save the Children here in Stockholm on our Swedish domestic program. I'm interested in, you've mentioned it a little bit, but the kind of intersection with ethnicity and race, and particularly when you talk about the moving families from different areas, but not only in terms of movement, but also schools. And I will explain why. So in relationship to Sweden, we ran a workshop 2 weeks ago with young people from one of the most segregated and deprived areas of Stockholm. And one of their reflections, where also the schools are particularly an issue in terms of achievement, many of them were reflecting on, well, the good schools are in the white areas of the city. Mm-hmm. We want to go to these schools, but we feel excluded and we don't feel comfortable when we are there. Yep. So that's point number one. Also, in relationship to that, a very kind of personal reflection. So my children are mixed race, and we used to live in a black area of the UK, where my daughter went to school in a very high achieving school, but with kids from the area. Now, she's never had any reflections on terms of her race. Mm-hmm. Now, my son is going to another school here in Sweden. He's 6 years old, and he's already starting to talk about it because there are children making comments to him. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, I think race plays a very important role in these issues. That's why I think the movers' evidence is important, because we find that actually, irrespective of your race, if we think about the moving to opportunity experiment, there are significant gains for both blacks and whites to moving to these more mixed income communities. But if they move at young ages, and I suspect that may have something to do with the types of things you're describing. So you find that when kids move at older ages, there isn't much of a gain at all, or sometimes there are negative effects. And that could be related to feeling, excluded, particularly for black kids who are moving to a more predominantly white area. It's conceivable that if you move at a very young age, you're more likely to get integrated into the community and overcome some of those racial boundaries. Now, that said, I still think it's plausible that if you take a child from a predominantly African-American community to a completely white area, you may not see the same types of gains. It's really critical that you have actual integration. So in the U.S., a different set of policies that have been attempted are school busing policies. So rather than having people move to a different area, just send the kids to school in different areas. We don't have great evidence on those programs, but my best sense is they don't work nearly as well as actually moving the family. And that, I think, also could be consistent with what you're saying, that it's critical to figure out how to actually achieve integration, not just take the kids there and then have them be excluded at the school based on their different race or some other factor. And so I don't know exactly how you do that, but I think you bring up a good point.
Okay. You mentioned that Sweden is a country with a lot of data. Mm-hmm. And also, of course, all your research, it's fantastic how you've been able to show also visually the results. But you also mentioned that it's being used, the data that you have in your different projects is being put to the use for not only researchers but also policymakers to follow what happens. Yeah. Could you dwell a little bit on that? And I would really also like to ask, is this type of availability present here in Stockholm in the terms that are actually being used by policymakers to show to find out what works in terms of policy changes? Could you please give a little light on that?
So I can talk a little bit about the U.S. experience, and then maybe Arash and others can comment about how people are using the data here. So in the U.S., as an example of the types of things that have come out of this work, so when we put out this study, the mayor of Atlanta, which was highlighted as a place that had very low levels of mobility, was very concerned about this. The first point he made is that it's not his fault that Atlanta has very low levels of mobility. But then he talked about, the various things they would try to do in that city to increase integration and so forth. So, and a number of cities have set up commissions in light of this data to say, how can we try to make positive changes to improve mobility? More generally, I mentioned earlier our work on health and life expectancy, where we've put out similar types of data. It's really useful for people to see in a uniform way across the country, to have objective measures of progress, because when you have kind of a third-party report based on uniform data, there's less political spin in that in terms of making some places look better than others, based on how exactly you analyze the data. And so I think that can be incredibly valuable at the local level. At the federal level, what I've found is there's increasing support in the U.S. from both sides, sides of the political spectrum, in terms of using evidence to inform policymaking, really seeing that we can evaluate the effects of these early childhood programs, or evaluate the effects of having better teachers. So Arash mentioned, President Obama talking about the teachers' work that I was describing in the State of the Union address. That led to a lot of school districts and also federal policy efforts to increase teacher evaluation and measure the performance of teachers and so forth. So I think there's a perception that this is an inexpensive way to try to improve the quality of policy, because we're not talking about conducting new trials or spending lots of additional money to try to collect these data. We already have these data, and let's just make better use of them and make them publicly available in ways that don't compromise confidentiality or security. And I think the U.S. has been able to move in a constructive direction. But often in the U.S., the conversation is that Sweden is far ahead in this context, so maybe you can talk about that.
I want to just take a different angle to your question, which is the question of availability of the data. Maybe that's a good place to compare also, because one thing I think happened in the US during the last years was the collaboration between academics and either public or private sector using this big data to answering the question that interests both sides. So to give example, for example, you saw that Raj is using IRS data, the tax authority data, with the collaboration with the tax authority. But also people are using data from the credit card companies in order to following the consumption and earnings in the real time in the US. Here, I think there's the same movement is happening. It's just a little slower maybe. But for example, I am part of the project with Johan, who is somewhere in the audience. I saw him. We're working in the employment office, for example, to get to answering the same question that you're interested on employment, using the big data that is interest on employment office and academic. So I think maybe that's a place to go forward, because the big concern always with big data is the data should be anonymized. And that's the concern that both sides have. And that's maybe the collaboration is the best way of keeping it.
Hello, Ola Pettersson, Swedish Trade Union Confederation. I have a question regarding segregation, which seems to be key to your speech. I guess we know quite a lot about processes of segregation. They're quite intuitive. What do we know about, how do you get to Sacramento, so to speak, processes of desegregation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I don't have a definitive answer, but the types of things that can matter, for instance, are zoning laws, for example. So what are the restrictions on how you can build in a city? The reason some cities in the South in the U.S., like Atlanta, look incredibly segregated is not just some sort of natural occurrence. It actually has a long history going back to racial issues in the U.S., particularly in the South, that led to laws that segregated the population that has persisted over time. And so analogously, I think changing restrictions on how housing is built, on gated communities where you have to have a minimum lot size, for example, are something that is naturally going to contribute to segregation, right? So creating more affordable housing or mixed income housing in an area is something that's going to combat that. I think another element that could be relevant here is transportation policy. So cities like Atlanta tend to be have very little public transportation, also perhaps related to the legacy of race in cities like that. And those cities also tend to be less integrated. I think when you have more of a public transit system, more people are able to get around more easily, you naturally have more mixing as well. So those are couple of thoughts. I think the housing voucher program in the U.S. also can serve as a vehicle for integration, because it can allow lower income families to afford housing in better areas, thereby integrating the city more. So I think there are things that can be done, but there's more to be learned.
Okay, so maybe I will take the last question. So, Raj, you told us about one of the measurements that of teacher quality, value added, and you are one of the proponents of this measurement. It seems that to measure the quality of a teacher using value added, we need quite a bit of data, in a sense that we need to see the quality of the students before the teacher is in contact with that student. And also we need to see the quality of the teacher, a student after that. What's the policy implication of that, the fact that we need, in some sense, follow the teacher for a while in order to understand if it's a good teacher or a bad teacher?
Yeah, that's a good... So these value-added measures, I focus on that partly because that happens to be something we can measure very well, and I think that's why the policy debate has gone in that direction in the U.S., because we tend to have that type of data in many cases. But you raise an important point, Arash, which is that creates a time lag in terms of how long it'll take to figure out whether a teacher is good or bad, right? And so there's a trade-off between having a precise measure of teacher quality and being able to act quickly. So it takes a few years of data before you can tell that it's not just by chance that a teacher is doing well or not doing well. And so that's a limitation of those measures. And a further limitation, which I think is actually quite important, while I think there is value in these measures, there's a lot that might not be captured by these test scores, right? So the critics of value-added measures often argue that there are a lot of things that teachers teach that are not just about how you do well on a standardized test. They're supposed to inspire you in various ways, spark creativity. Maybe all that doesn't get picked up on a test. And I'm totally sympathetic to that view. I think what we're showing here is that these measures capture something about teacher quality that's relevant for kids' long-term success. But what I'd like to see in this literature is more measurement of other aspects of teacher quality. So, you could imagine having principals rate the quality of teachers, or have students give feedback on how well the teachers are doing, or have other types of measures of the effectiveness of teachers. And I suspect that a lot of those other measures will be valuable as well and might help us ultimately make decisions more quickly. So I think the way you want to think about the value added is just that it's one step towards measuring the quality of teachers, but we need to do more to have more comprehensive measures that can be used for policy purposes.
So maybe the last word, I give the last word to Uma.
Well, just a very, very short thank you. And I think all of us who has been here, and also my colleagues here at SNS, have noted that you have touched upon, I think, 5 or 6 policy issues which we're actually having some research projects on or having seminar series around. And I think that you have touched all of those issues are issues which are terribly important to Sweden today. And I think also many of the issues that you mentioned are also very much related to the change that is going on in Sweden in terms of having new Swedes coming in and all the issues related to that. And it was also very interesting to hear how your research is being used by policymakers, and also how also the follow-up in terms of actually evaluating what works and what does not work. And I think there were so many lessons for us at SNS, and I think also for all of us who were here, and also I think so many research issues that we feel we would like to come back to and hope to have an interesting discussion with you who are here, but also anytime you come back. We would be so happy to have you here again, I want to say it. And first of all, thank you very much for taking the time to come and talk to us today. And also a great thank you to Jakob and all the others at the Institute and our very good moderator for doing this together with us. A big thank you.
Thank you.